I think I'm going to start introducing Professor Finckh. Maria Finckh is the Dean of the Faculty of Organic Agricultural Science at the University of Kassel in Germany. And today she will talk about glyphosate, which we all know is a very common and very controversial pesticide, very much in use in conventional agriculture. And her talk is about the way that it has impact on plant, animal, and human health through the microbiome. And we will do it like that Maria Finckh will present her current and very actual research. And then we have Benassa Alawi. I don't know about Thoraya Swisi. She's not with us yet. But Benassa Alawi will then after the presentation reply with some insights for the MENA region and especially the Moroccan or the Maghreb context. So we have some kind of regional contextualization to this. And we had some started already some informal discussions here. So I think this is going to be very interesting. Other than the last sessions, this is going to be a bit lengthy, not lengthy, but longer. About 90 minutes, I think, 1.5 hours are scheduled for this because the presentation is a bit longer and we didn't want to take anything away from this. What else is there to say? Of course, for everyone who doesn't know, this is the 7th seminar in the Aurora webinar series. Aurora is a consortium coordinated by University of Kassel with partner institutions in the MENA region, in Tunisia, in Morocco, and in Lebanon. And this is our 2nd year of the 4-year project, and we're very happy to be able to have this platform for interesting discussions on sustainable agri-food systems in the MENA region, but also beyond that. So without further ado, I give over to Maria Finckh. You should be able to, the screen sharing is started, and please enjoy the talk. And by the way, it is recorded and it will be put on our YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me get rid of this silly thing here. Okay. Still have too many faces on my screen. Okay, well, welcome everyone to my presentation on the indirect effects of the herbicide glyphosate on plant, animal, and human health through its effects on microbial communities. I want to give an introduction about glyphosate, its mode of action, then look at the effect of microbiomes in health, and then a few conclusions. There's a long version of this presentation that you can find in YouTube. At the end, I will give you the link again. And I tried to shorten this presentation so that we really remain in the more normal time for this seminar. First, what is glyphosate? Glyphosate is the active ingredient of the herbicide Roundup and others, and there's more than 70 glyphosate-based herbicides on the market worldwide. It's originally has been developed as a disinfectant, and it was an accident actually that the herbicidal effects were discovered because the original discoverers found it not strong enough as a disinfectant and then gave it to Monsanto because they were not interested. The decomposition of the N-phosphonomethylglycine is into AMPA, which is aminomethylphosphonic acid. That's done by bacteria. The toxicity profile of AMPA is the same as that of glyphosate. The mode of action of glyphosate is basically, in terms of being a herbicide, the mode of action is by inhibiting the shikimate pathway. It's shikimate is phosphoenol pyruvate for phosphate pathway that then ends up in certain cyclic aromatic amino acids. And it's basically the synthesis of aromatic amino acids is blocked. And that is, of course, very important. It's tryptophan, phenylene, alanine, and tyrosine. They are all involved, among others, in plant and microbe responses to survival, growth, defense, and secondary metabolites. And they have a lot to do also with resistance to pathogens. These proteins are important also in many organisms, not only in plants, but also bacteria, fungi, protozoas, and algae all have the same shikimate pathway. And that means that glyphosate does not only act on plants, it also acts on other organisms. The second mode of action of glyphosate is that it is an antibiotic. It has been patented as such, and they were hoping actually for a while that they could use it as a malaria medical, but it didn't work. But what is really funny, if you read what is written in this patent, they say that as antimicrobials, it is expected to induce stasis rather than cell lysis or death, allowing the infection to be cleared by the host's immune system. This is really weird because normally we are asked to take antibiotics to the end to make sure that all the causal organisms are killed so we don't cause resistance. So this is a weak antibiotic that apparently does not necessarily kill so much, but it just slows down the growth of microorganisms. When we look at the herbicidal effect of the active ingredient glyphosate, when it was first introduced, people were told you need about 0.7 kilo per hectare in order to kill all plants. This is 0.07 gram per square meter. It's not much. But we have herbicides that are stronger than that. Currently in Europe, it's between 1 and 1.1 kilo per hectare that are being used to kill plants. And what happens if glyphosate is applied? It destroys all animal habitat above ground. And what you see here on the right side is USDA numbers on how much active ingredient is applied per hectare. And you can see it went up from the beginnings. Here is the 0.7 kilo per hectare in 1995, and it really took off. By now, people are applying close to 2 kilo per hectare. Because the effectiveness has gone down. And what you see, this is a picture from Brazil. Of course, you also see glyphosate resistance, which is naturally occurring in certain plants, and glyphosate resistant genetically modified plants actually possess a gene that has been transferred from natural glyphosate resistance. That, for example, hairy vetch or so is naturally glyphosate resistant. Looking at glyphosate resistance worldwide, you can find these data on the internet. In 2018, there was the last species on the list was Lactuca saligna. I went back to the internet and checked it out. And now we are in 2020, and you see here the Lactuca saligna is here in 2018, and we have added many more within 2 years only. So glyphosate resistance is going up rapidly. Many species can already resist the herbicide. So this is quite normal for herbicides. Usually the weeds lose their susceptibility to the toxins. Glyphosate use is very high. I don't have the actual numbers for nowadays, but in 2014, they used about 830,000 tons worldwide. And in the US, about 1 kilo of active ingredient per hectare was used per year in the cropland area, and worldwide it was about 0.5 kilo active ingredient per hectare. Looking at German numbers, that's a little bit easier. About 1/3 of the cropland is treated annually with glyphosate, And in 2020, I calculated this now, looking at how much glyphosate was being sold and dividing by 1/3 of the cropland, then I get at 0.66 kilo active ingredient per hectare that was treated with glyphosate. What happens with glyphosate in the environment? If glyphosate is applied before planting, there will be a few weeds sitting here. They are missing in this picture, of course, but the weeds will take up the glyphosate and translocate it into the ground via the roots. But the glyphosate also is applied to the naked soil because a lot of the soil is not covered. And so there is also washout to the groundwater. There's evaporation and wind distribution with the soil dust, of course. Then when glyphosate is taken up by plants, it can be transported with pollen. It's transported upwards and downwards by the plants. For GMO plants, of course, we also have the problem that it may be released via the pollen. If it's sprayed before harvest for siccation, which is often done in areas where the cereals have problems drying before harvest, then the crops are not totally dead, and that means they take up the glyphosate and it may be translocated also into the grains and especially in the straw. And that has consequences. And again, they translocate into the root system, and the older the plants, the deeper the roots, the deeper the translocation. So it goes in the atmosphere, it goes into the ground, and it goes into the surface water. When we look at a recent study that was done in Germany, this study shows that all samples of non-biological origin, and it was 100% of all passive samplers and filters that were set up in Germany, Germany-wide, contained glyphosate. And this is just to give you an idea. The red bars are for glyphosate, the blue ones are for AMPA. And you can see that depending where you are in Germany, especially in the north, more glyphosate is applied than in the south. This is also because this is where more cereals are grown, and here's more greenland. And this is from the year 2021. It was published, and I think it was sampled in 2020. Glyphosate has been found in Germany up to 4.5 meters deep in the soil. That means what very often people are being told, that glyphosate is absorbed to soil particles and is not translocated, but is not true. It is translocated, and this is connected also to the amount of phosphorus in the soil. Phosphorus fertilization will release glyphosate from the soil particles and make it more mobile to move down into the deeper soil layers where no microbial degradation will happen anymore. Glyphosate residues dominate in surface waters in central Germany, for example, and you can see here the maximum pesticide concentrations that were found. This here is glyphosate, the next one is AMPA, and you can see glyphosate is dominating absolutely. And here's also the mean 0.15 micrograms per liter versus AMPA only a quarter of that, and the other pesticides only 1/15 of glyphosate. So it is very clear that glyphosate is one of the dominant pesticides that are being used worldwide. Now looking at the effects of glyphosate on microbiomes and health, which is the main topic. And I want to look quickly at the microbiome. What does it mean, and how we measure things, and what does the dysbiosis really mean, and give a few examples. Who is it? We know about 9,000 bacterial species. We estimate about between 1 million and 1 billion species should exist. We really don't know much. we really can find most of them only through DNA analysis, because most bacteria we cannot grow in the laboratory outside their normal environment. And DNA analysis usually enables us, maybe, to identify the empires, the kingdoms, the classes, and maybe the families of the bacteria, not the species. So what usually you find, Acidobacteria, Actinobacteria, Aquiferae, and so on, many of these different groups, but very rarely do you really know who is it. And then the question is, how do we quantify what we don't know? So what is usually done, we look at microbial activity. So we measure metabolic processes. And as bacteria are small, one can say that the metabolic processes are correlate with the amount of microorganisms around. We can also measure microbial biomass. We can search for known species. We can classify according to higher taxonomic orders. But there it gets very problematic already. For example, what you very often see in publications, these people found proteobacteria or gamma proteobacteria, then it gets a little closer. But let's look, alpha proteobacteria, they contain, and everything that's red, I know is a problematic microorganism, either for animals or plants. Brucella, Agrobacterium, Rickettsia. Next to Rhizobia, Colobacter, I think is also a negative one, but Rhizobia, very important for us, very positive bacteria. Beta proteobacteria, they have Ralstonia, but they also have the nitrogen cycling bacteria, Nitrosomonas. Then we have Escherichia pseudomonas together with Shigella, Salmonella, Yersinia, that's the bacterium causing pest. So, it is not so simple to say, oh, we have alpha proteobacteria, this is nice. Not at all. We don't know who we have if people tell you there's a lot of alpha proteobacteria. It's just a group. So depending on how one looks, one will find effects on microbial communities or not. I'll just give you an example of two microbiomes I constructed. This is the first microbiome. It has green bacteria and it has one red one. So we have two species, but you can see the green ones are dominating. This is the same microbiome, the same bacteria, same number, but a different distribution of the two species. So we have the same number of individuals. So the metabolic activity and biomass will be basically the same. We have the same species, the green and the red. So these two measures will give us no difference in the microbial world. But the equilibrium is shifted. And this is something that is very difficult to find out at times. And it is very important to look at the microbiota in the right way. So we can quantify genes that are connected to specific functions. For example, nitrogen cycling, manganese reduction, antibiotic resistance, and so on. This at least gives us more of an idea of who is who and who is doing what. And I want to take a little excursion to what do we know about microorganisms. Many of us grew up like, oh, microorganisms, microbes, and the foremost enemy of humans. But we have found out now that we cannot eliminate them. And also that we know that they are very important. Yeah? On the one hand, we cannot eliminate them. We have created the conditions for recombinant viruses and antibiotic-resistant bacteria. By encroaching on habitat, we get more closer and closer with pathogens that we don't need. Most of the diseases that we humans have, we got from our animals anyways, by living together with them. But we have recognized now that microbes are part of our very being. Our health depends on the symbiotic bacteria that helps build and maintain our healthy bodies. the body's immune system has evolved to recognize the difference between benign and potentially pathogenic bacteria. And now we know by now that we are not alone. If you look at me, if you look at yourself, every human being contains about 22,000 genes that we inherited from our parents, and about 8 million different genes that we inherited from the parents' bacteria, and that mostly from the mother's bacteria, of course. And so by now, in biology, we stop talking about individuals. We talk about hologenomes. The individual or plant or any other multicellular organism is more or less a consortium. And if you take away all the microorganisms out of the animals or plants, they are dead. They are dead. And we all know that. So 90 to 99% of all cells found in a human being are microorganisms. And we cannot exist without them. So dysbiosis is now a new disease that is basically due to deficient or aberrant microbiomes. And these are more and more recognized as the underlying causes of diseases, including mental problems. For example, we know that children that are not born in the normal way, but for example, through cesarean, they are often deficient in the microbiome. And the modern clinics will inoculate babies that are born through cesarean with the microbiome of the mothers. But in many places, this is not known. And we know this is connected to the rise of allergies, for example, because the immune system is overreacting and has not been primed by the right microorganisms. The use of antibiotics changes the microflora. And glyphosate is patented as an antibiotic. So what does that mean? When we think about glyphosate and dysbiosis, we apply glyphosate to the soil and to the plants. It goes inside the plants, it goes through the plants into the rhizosphere and into the soil. So there may be a dysbiosis in the ground. There is residues inside the plants, they go directly into people, or they go via the animals, then into people. And so you may have dysbiosis not only in the rhizosphere of the plants, you may have it in the stomach of the animals and in the stomachs of people. I want to give an example of the antibiotic glyphosate and bee colony collapse disorder that is very relevant to the world. And we have seen a lot of that. For this, you should know that neonate bees, that means newborn bees, are sterile. They have to be inoculated by their colleagues, by the worker bees, with the vital intestinal bacteria that largely run the immune system of the cold-blooded animals. And this is because the worker bees, they go and feed outside and then they regurgitate what they ate and give it to the young bees. And by this, the bees are inoculated with the microbiome of the beehive. Now, the question that colleagues asked was, what are the effects of glyphosate on the intestinal flora of bees? So they fed neonate bees, they took them out just in the moment when they emerged from the pupa, and they fed them with glyphosate in a sterile glucose. And they found that bacterial growth in neonates was reduced due to the antibiotic effect of glyphosate, and that there was a shift in the composition of the intestinal flora. Then they went in and looked at what does it do to the susceptibility of the bees to an opportunistic pathogen, which is Serratia marquescens. They fed the neonates 5 days with gut homogenate, that means what comes out of the guts of the worker bees, or with microbial-free glucose. And they combine the gut homogenate or the microbial-free glucose with glyphosate either at 0.5 or 1 milligram per liter concentration, with or without. Then they looked at the survival of the bees. They put them back into the hive and looked at the survival over time. And so you have here the bees that are fed only with the gut homogenate with glyphosate, microbial free with glyphosate. And you see there's no difference. All the bees behave about the same and have the same survival over time. But when they added, so in the absence of the pathogen, there was nothing to be found in the beehive. But when the pathogen was added, the Serratia, the bees that were fed with the gut homogenate, about 45% of them died. So it's a pretty grave pathogen, but still half of the bees survived. But all the bees that received gut homogenate with glyphosate or were only fed with sterile solution with or without glyphosate had dramatic death rates. And that means you could really see that the gut homogenate, if it is kept intact with all the microbes that are needed, it can protect quite well from the opportunistic pathogen Serratia. 50% death rate is bad, but 90% is worse. So what does 0.5 to 1 milligram of liter of glyphosate really mean? Does it have to do with reality? If 1 kilo of glyphosate is applied in 200 liters of water, which is the typical way of applying glyphosate to 1 hectare, this means 5 milligrams per milliliter glyphosate are applied. This is 5 grams per liter. We talk here about 0.5 to 1 milligram per liter. So the experiment was done with concentrations 10,000 times lower than the concentration applied to plants. This is because they wanted to have the concentrations that may arrive in the nectar of GMO plants by being taken up by the plants and then transferred into the nectar. And that's why it's relevant in GMO plants. They had measured what they find in nectar, and this is how they came up with this concentration. But when the plants are not GMO, like in Germany, when they are sprayed with 5 grams per liter in a first step, the concentration will rise during drying. That means the plants are wet and then they will dry. During the time when the plants are wet, bees may come and take up glyphosate directly out of the spray solution. If the spray is applied early morning and then bees start flying and get the water and get whatever they want to get from the field. And they also feed on plants that are not yet dead. So bees that visit non-GMO or GMO plants shortly after they received an application will be exposed to much higher concentrations than tested by the people in the US that did the bee study I just reported. And it's not a fairy tale, but reality. This is a picture I took from a demonstration in Germany where farmers complained that they had to dispose of 4 tons of honey in Germany because it was contaminated with glyphosate at levels that they could not sell it anymore. Let's look at glyphosate and dysbiosis in humans. There's a paper that was published only a couple of years back, and they looked at what is actually happening with the question of not being able to eat wheat. Wheat sensitivity has been rising like crazy in recent years, and they wanted to know, is it only because people have celiac disease, or are there other reasons? So they put a hypothesis and they said, okay, if people eat a lot of residues of glyphosate, they may change the microbiome in their own guts. And there are organisms that are sensitive to glyphosate, those are the green guys. And there are organisms that are more resistant to glyphosate, those are the red guys. And that means the microbiome, the normal microbiome, will shift towards the red guys because the green guys are suppressed. So they checked which bacteria are increasing in the presence of herbicide, of glyphosate alone or glyphosate-based herbicides, and which bacteria are decreased. So with glyphosate alone, you see Spirocheta, Fusobacteria, Prevotella, Actinomyces all may increase, Butyriccoccus was decreased. When they used glyphosate-based herbicides, there were many more organisms affected because the ingredients of glyphosate-based herbicides themselves also have effects on the microbiome. And of course, there were some that were affected by both. So, and then they looked at the data in Canada in this case, and they looked at the data who was avoiding gluten in the people. So they found that out of 100 people that avoided gluten, 44% did not have celiac disease in the year 2009-2010. So they avoided gluten not for genetic reasons or did not know that they have celiac disease. 51% of them actually had celiac disease, but it was not recognized, and 5% knew. So 56% were celiac, 44% were not celiac. They avoided wheat for other reasons. 4 years later, it was most people who had celiac disease by now knew it, and it was 28% of the people who avoided gluten were celiac, but 72% that avoid gluten did not have celiac disease. And the question was why? Why are so many people avoiding gluten and saying, if we don't eat wheat, we feel better? So let's look at what is actually happening. Looking at the residue allowances in the USA, which are the same as in Canada. This is in parts per million. We have the data from 1993 up to 2015. In 1996, glyphosate-resistant GMO plants were introduced in the USA, and glyphosate use rose dramatically. What you see here, that from 1993 to 99, there was a jump, especially in soybean, hay, and feed. Also in wheat, residues were actually allowed for animal feed before there were no allowances, and the same in lucerne alfalfa. Here you see between 0 and 500 ppm allowed. For human food, the scale is only 0 to 50, so for humans it's much lower, but still you see there's a jump in 2015. In wheat, it went up from 5 to 30 ppm allowance in residues. And the reason is that in the moment that the residues allowed in the US and Canada always were increased when they realized that the residues were so high that they could not sell the stuff anymore. It was not because they found that glyphosate is not toxic, but it was because they said, if we have residue allowances that cannot be kept by the farmers, then we cannot have such allowances. We have to increase them. So in animal feed by 2015, 100 to 400 ppm were allowed. In North America, mean annual consumption of wheat by humans is 67 kilo. That's a lot. Incidentally, a sister-in-law of mine, she had a good friend, American, living in Germany, next door to her, and when they and she was very happy in Germany because she could eat wheat. And when she went back to the US, she immediately got allergic to wheat again, which she did not have a problem in Germany. So the question is, what's the problem? When we look at the residues in plant products in urine, the maximum residue levels depend on country and crop. So you can see they vary between 0.5 to 40 milligram for legumes, 0.1 to 30, 1 to 40 in oil seeds, and that's of course the soybean. And also in fodder for animals, it gets very high, but what has been measured usually exceeds what has been allowed. The maximum residue limits in general rose with the increase in detected concentrations. Residues are generally higher in North and South America than in Europe. And high percentages of human urine samples are contaminated with glyphosate. And the newest paper just came out a few weeks back where they described that quantifiable urine glyphosate levels detected in 99% of the French population, with higher values in men, in younger people, and in farmers. And this is not the first paper I'm reporting. This is just the most recent that I'm aware of. Already 8 years back, Swanson et al. Started looking at US statistics over time. They looked at a lot of different diseases, a total of more than 30. And they produced graphics looking at the number of people either dying per 100,000 or being affected, depending on the disease, per year. And you can see that from 1990 on, the number of people dying of intestinal infections rose dramatically. At the same time, they plotted glyphosate applied to corn and soybean, because in 1996, the GMO took off and the soybean and corn were grown, and you can see how glyphosate went up. They found this for intestinal infections. They also found it for diabetes. There was an overall trend of increased diabetes because people are eating more and more sugar. But diabetes went dramatically up since 1996, together with glyphosate on corn and soy and genetically engineered soy and corn crops. The same with autism. Again, dramatic increase since 1996. What is this? Those are correlations with human diseases and glyphosate use in the USA. All these diseases can be caused by dysbiosis, and I'll show this. But those are correlations, and a correlation is not a cause. And what the authors are saying very clearly, we have to look into this. Is there anything to it? If we find so many very high correlations, then statistical probability says this is not just an accident. So we need research to either refute or confirm these connections. Dysbiosis are overall increasing. We see correlations with glyphosate use. We see connections with the use of antibiotics. We see connection with pseudohormone active chemicals. And we see connections with changes in microbiome and development. All these we have spelled out in our paper in more detail. So we need to investigate these connections because this is not harmless to think about this. So if we think about glyphosate and antibiotic resistance, we also have to think about antibiotic resistance in the environment. What we know is that microorganisms differ in their resistance to glyphosate, depending on the EPSPS pathway, on the shikimate pathway. By now, we actually have 4 different shikimate pathways, but the type 1 and type 2 are the dominant ones. And the type 1 shikimate pathway, they are sensitive to glyphosate. The type 2, they have increased glyphosate tolerance. But as I pointed out before, it's rare that glyphosate directly kills, it just inhibits the growth and shifts the frequencies. We have high glyphosate tolerance in Clostridium, Fusobacterium, Salmonella, Clostridium tetani, in Orthobacter, and in many Fusaria and Helicobacter. And we have many plant endophytes and beneficial human gut bacteria that are highly glyphosate sensitive. And it has been shown by now that the levels shift within the microbiomes. So this has an influence on animal and plant health. So if we look at this, autism correlates with glyphosate-tolerant Clostridium infections. So if autistic people were cleared from these Clostridium infections, autism was reduced. We have a lot of cross-resistances with antibiotics and glyphosate. So we have known cross-resistances with penicillin, ciprofloxacin, kanamycin. Those are three different antibiotic groups. Ciprofloxacin and kanamycin are reserve antibiotics. We are using them when nothing else helps. And there is data that show that after glyphosate exposure, Salmonella were more resistant against ciprofloxacin and kanamycin. And there's a US study, for example, that compared the effect of NPK fertilizer versus manure on antibiotic resistance in the soils. They used manure from animals that were not treated with antibiotics. They came from an experimental herd. And then they wrote a paper because what their data said that the manure enriched taxa that commonly carry resistance to beta-lactam antibiotics, those are the penicillin. And they wrote, we don't know why. We cannot understand this. But if you know that the animals that are fed in a herd, in an experimental herd, in a US facility, most likely have received a lot of GMO maize and also straw from wheat that has been siccated with glyphosate. And so these animals have been fed a lot of residues of glyphosate. And that means in the manure of the animals, mixed with the straw, there will be glyphosate residues that have been applied to the ground compared to NPK, which is a pure chemical fertilizer. And it could be that it is simply that increased the glyphosate resistance in the soils. The authors of the New Zealand study wrote a very worrisome sentence. They said, neither reducing the use of antibiotics nor discovery of new ones may be sufficient strategies to avoid the post-antibiotic era. We see how dramatic are the effects of COVID-19 now. One reason is that viruses cannot be treated with antibiotics. But think about multi-resistance. This is killing more people already now than COVID is killing. Nobody's talking about that. But the real pandemic running in this world are multi-resistant bacteria. So we wrote a paper a couple of years back on the cycling of microbial communities as a connecting force for soil, plant, animal, human, and ecosystem health. And so we cannot say it doesn't matter what we do to the soil because it all is connected and is connected to us. And the more stress is applied, the more problems we will have. And there's a new paper that came out only a year and a half ago about the concept of One Health via microorganisms. And a very nice graph showing what happens if we apply, if we have antibiotic resistance in individual microbiota, local groups, nations, continents, global natural environments. And this is connected to how we behave. It's connected to social norms. It's connected to what the group is doing to protect itself. And it has an effect on everything. Globalization processes, world economy, overpopulation, all this is playing a role. And veterinarian medicines and antibiotic active herbicides, and it's not only glyphosate, there's many other herbicides also, foremost the dicamba. They are all applied on a large scale worldwide. And this is part of what's causing the antibiotic resistance epidemic that we have, pandemic. Glyphosate works on the microorganisms in the soil, in the rhizosphere, and in plants. We have changes in microbial communities that have been shown in and on plants through glyphosate. For example, growth-promoting pseudomonads are reduced. Reduced nutrient availability leads to increased fertilizer needs. And that means plant nutrition is compromised by glyphosate. This is a picture that was taken at the University of Hohenheim in Germany a few years back. It was an accidental discovery. They had several fields that were managed differently, and there were the whitish fields that you see here where growth is compromised had been treated with glyphosate on a regular basis for 11 years. And there were two fields where they had not used glyphosate for the first 9 years and only started 2 years ago. and they see how much better the plants grow where little glyphosate had been applied in comparison to where a lot of glyphosate had been applied. And that's how they found out that glyphosate chelates important nutrients and makes them unavailable for plants. And therefore, glyphosate residues in the soil are extremely relevant. We also see that the bacterial microbiome on the root surface due to glyphosate is changing. There's differential abundance of genes from soybean, GMO soybean rhizosphere with and without glyphosate application. You see, without glyphosate, everything is shifted, and there's some blue guys that are only showing up without glyphosate, and there are the yellow ones that show up only with glyphosate. The brown ones show up in both cases. Many metabolic genes and genes of individual organisms were more prevalent after application of diluted glyphosate on leaves of GR soybeans. And some functional genes, plant growth promotion and N fixation in organisms were less prevalent after glyphosate treatment. So they could show there were shifts on what happened in the rhizosphere of the soybeans. When you look at plant diseases, which is of course where I come from, they were looking at Fusarium severity on GMO maize. Fusarium is causing also mycotoxins, which are very problematic in many cases. So they looked at glyphosate application to the GMO maize, none up to 300 millimole per liter. And you could see that Fusarium verticillioides or Fusarium oxysporum both increased dramatically. It was very interesting because Fusarium growth itself is also delayed and slower in Petri dishes with glyphosate. So if you just take the Fusarium, you can show that it is also inhibited by glyphosate. But on the root surfaces, the antagonists of Fusarium, especially Pseudomonads, are suppressed by glyphosate, and therefore Fusaria can grow faster and are not thought of as by natural biocontrol anymore because of the suppression of the beneficial organisms. And this is one last thing I just want to point out. It's textbook knowledge. Plants take up CO2, they produce organic acids, and they give about 30 to 60% of what they assimilate is released into the ground as organic acids. It's the carbon that feeds the soil microbiome. Without the carbon brought into the soil by plants, there will be no life in the soil. And that means the life around the roots of plants is, of course, the highest. And the microbiome in the ground, the bacteria, the fungi, they supply in turn the plants with nitrogen, phosphorus, sometimes also water, depending, and many other micronutrients. So plants that die because they are sprayed with a herbicide, they secrete more carbon into the ground and they attract microorganisms. The microbiome shifts because the plants also secrete glyphosate. And that means there's a shift towards pathogens. And in addition, the plants, especially the GMO plants, produce less defense-related metabolites. And that makes them much more susceptible to pathogens. And in the end, more fungicides are needed to protect the plants because they are GMO and treated with glyphosate. And we also have potentially changes in the associated endophytes. That means the organisms that live inside plants. In summary, glyphosate is found everywhere in the environment, in air, soil, water, and it accumulates. It's an antibiotic that causes microbiome shifts in the soil, in plants, in animals, and thus also in humans. Changes in the composition of the microbiome can lead to dysbiosis. The antibiotic glyphosate causes cross-resistances against several important classes of antibiotics. And this has consequences for agriculture. We have increased disease susceptibility of GMO plants, especially to soil-borne diseases. We have reduced nutrient availability. We have increased need for fungicides and fertilizers. We have disturbed intestinal microflora and diseases in animals and humans. We have increased antibiotic resistance in the environment. And that means there's a need to apply the precautionary principle. The connections between glyphosate diseases, including dysbiosis, need to be investigated in series. And a large-scale application of an antibiotic like glyphosate and some other herbicides is insane and needs to be banned. I would like to thank Professor Irina van Bruggen, who has taken the lead on these studies. She's an eminent microbiologist and plant pathologist, and from the Plant Pathology Department and Emerging Pathogens Institute of the University of Florida. And just here, the information, if you Google glyphosate indirect effects on health via the microbiome, you will find on YouTube a long version of this. Thank you very much.
والله الحمد لله. انت كيف الصحة شو اخر والله الحمد لله بخير.
Thank you. There's someone that I have to keep silent. Yeah, thank you very much. Now we will have a kind of not reply, but a kind of discussant in Sibenasa Alawi, who is a professor from IAV Hassan II in Morocco, in Rabat, Morocco, and eminent member of the Aurora Consortium. Please, you have, I think, 10 minutes to reply, and then we will have an open discussion.
Thank you, Soren. Can I share my screen?
Yes. Wait a second. I'll make you a co-host. Oh no, that was wrong. So now you should be able to share the screen. We only see white space right now.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Okay, right.
Can you see it now?
No, not yet.
Oh. So then I didn't share it properly. How about now?
Yes.
You can see it?
Yeah, but not the presentation side, only the
No? Can you see my screen now?
No, not your screen, only the present, like the software. You could do it like this, of course, but it's nicer if you have the presentation.
I cannot see.
Oh yeah, yes, no, it's good.
It's good?
Yeah, I hope it also moves. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Soren. Thank you, Dr. Maria Pinch, for this very interesting presentation. But it's also a little bit frightening if we don't do anything about what you have talked about everywhere in the world to reduce the impact, the negative impact of not only glyphosate but also other herbicides and fungicides and insecticides. I will not be discussing, but I have been asked to talk about the glyphosate studies in Morocco. as I stopped working on herbicides maybe 25 years ago. I worked on herbicide from 83 to 96, 97, and then I shifted to organic agriculture, organic farming, because I manipulated too much of herbicides and even some radioactive herbicides in the United States and in Morocco too. So I hope you can see the next. Can you see the administration point of view?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I will share with you the status of glyphosate in Morocco, and by giving the administration point of view, the farmers' representatives' point of view, and finally end my presentation on positive note, showing that there is the largest agricultural company stopped using glyphosate since 2016, which is a positive thing. So for the administration or the Ministry of Agriculture point of view, and according to the National Office for Health and Food Safety website called ONSA, prohibition of formulations containing glyphosate in combination with the coformulant POE toluamine back in 2018. Comparison in France, it was prohibited in 2016. So the General Director of the National Office for Health and Food Safety addressed a letter to the President of the Moroccan Interprofessional Federation for the Production and Exportation of Fruits and Vegetables, very active association of farmers. So he informed them of the withdrawal of pesticides for agricultural use, mainly glyphosate in combination with the coformulant POE toluamine. He also added that the decision was made following a reevaluation process of these herbicides, which revealed an unacceptable risk to human health, resulting mainly from the use of glyphosate preparations, because there are several of them, in combination with the coformulant I mentioned. He also clarified that other glyphosate products are still authorized to meet the needs of farmers. So only glyphosate with given coformulant was stopped from use. What is problematic is from the date that this glyphosate with the formulation that I mentioned was made official, Morocco stopped importing the active ingredients, but the government or the ministry gave a period of 6 months after the withdrawal date for the wholesale distribution. So the companies or the chemical companies continues to sell, to do wholesale distribution of that formulation with the glyphosate. And the ministry also gave a period of 18 months after the withdrawal date for retail distribution and use by farmers. So we mentioned that it's dangerous, but we give 18 months to allow the use of the chemical anyway. So if you enter the ONSA website, we can see that glyphosate is there, and we can see also that there are 18 products based on glyphosate that they are still on the Moroccan market. And on the same website, we still give information on how to use the different types of glyphosate formulation on citrus trees, for broadleaf and grass weeds, for dicotyledons and grass weeds that are perennial, for fruit trees, for annual weeds, and also for perennial weeds, for olive trees. For fruit trees and olive trees, there are two combinations of herbicides with glyphosate. The first one is glyphosate with oxyfluorphin, and the second one for olive trees and for other fruit trees also is glyphosate with the fluorphenicam. And for broad beans or faba beans, you know that glyphosate is used for Orobanche control, but at lower doses. Now we will talk about the farmer's point of view. According to the president of the National Peasants Union of Morocco, he repeatedly warned, according to him, the supervisory ministry about the dangers of glyphosate. He also mentioned that these alerts remained unanswered, and according to this activist who deplores that the subject remains unfortunately very taboo within institutions, where experts are under a lot of pressure not to address the real health risks of glyphosate, according to the National Peasant Union Secretary. So for him, for the same person, the situation is alarming, so much so that the number of cancer patients in some agricultural regions where this herbicide have been used will exceed the figures in urban areas. He also said that the most identified cancers among Moroccan farmers are related to the respiratory system and the skin, while other farmers have lost their sight partially or entirely because of this product. Always according to the National Peasant Union Secretary. With regards to ONSA, which is the office that is responsible for the use of all chemicals, all herbicides, and for health, everything, they hold farmers fully responsible for any inappropriate use of glyphosate. I can talk about farmers not protecting themselves when they are applying the herbicide, other herbicide, not only glyphosate. They don't use masks, they don't use, they don't protect their hands, and they don't use even boots to protect their feet. I will end this short presentation by on positive note, saying that the les domaines agricoles, which are the largest company active in agricultural production in Morocco, they are the pioneers of glyphosate-free agriculture in Morocco. As a reminder, as I said, Domaine Agricole is a Moroccan group operating in the fields of agricultural and industrial production for more than 50 years. They are involved in many sectors of Moroccan agriculture, citrus fruits, diverse fruit trees, vegetables, livestock farming, mainly meat and dairy processing, aromatic plants, annual crops, beekeeping, and aquaculture. So these large domains aware that glyphosate is at the heart of a global health controversy and that its harms are probable. The domain agricole began their exit from glyphosate back in 2016, 6 years ago, and placed themselves at the forefront of the agricultural transition towards a more responsible practice and more durable. We hope that the ministry also follows the path. It's not the case, unfortunately. So by abandoning glyphosate very early, those large domains declared that they are at the forefront of the challenges of Morocco, tomorrow's agriculture and consumer expectations. This is the end of my short presentation. If you have any question related to this presentation, I will be glad to answer your question. And thank you very much. Shukran, and looking forward to your feedback.
Yes, thank you very much for this great addition that shows us a country case study, so to say, about the current state of glyphosate regulation and the situation in farming on the ground. I think I'll stop here. Okay. Now I think we have another about 15 to 20 minutes for discussion. We don't need all the 20 minutes if you don't want to, but we can have a discussion now, and I open the floor for questions after these two discussions. I'm sure there's a lot of room for exchange. Any questions or comments from the audience? Oh yeah, Professor Finckh herself.
Yeah, maybe just a warning. What is a great worry is that people will simply replace glyphosate with other herbicides. And if you compare the toxicity of glyphosate with other herbicides, one has to say that glyphosate is oftentimes less toxic. It's the sheer amount of glyphosate that is being applied that makes the problem. And it's not only the toluamines, but it's also other adjuvants that act as herbicides themselves. I put a reference to a paper that showed that in the chat. And the real problem is that we need to think in a way that make herbicides less necessary and not to just shift away from one to another, because that will not be the solution.
Yes, thank you. That was a very clear statement. Andreas, please.
Yes, thanks a lot, most of all, to Maria, really, for this great presentation. A dear colleague of mine, the dean of my faculty, very glad to have you here, and very glad also to actually exchange on your work. Although I have to say, it's not my area, so it will be a layperson's question on the margin, really. But I think it's been very impressive what you assembled as research and data and understanding of this problem. So I had two questions, which, as mentioned, are a bit on the margin, I suppose, but still they're interesting from my perspective. So I came a bit late, so maybe you touched upon this. But this issue of how to use glyphosate, how do you see those practices in the European or in the German context? How is that addressed? Is that effectively addressed? Does that make a difference? What is the role also of public dissemination in a sense and extension services in addressing this, because they're kind of maybe in a double role. They're kind of well, advising on glyphosate and precaution from an official perspective, but also at the same time being a bit, at the same time admitting it to some extent. So I would just be because one easily puts this on educational deficits or things like that in the global south, but I would just like to understand a bit better how this is dealt with here. And the second question is more on personal experience or living this kind of research experience that you have. And I think probably Professor Alawi and you, Maria, Professor Finckh, you can probably both reflect on that. These are extremely sensitive and touchy issues. So how is it to move with this topic in the research communities, in your respective research communities? How is that working? How is that possible in Moroccan context? How do you experience that? What do colleagues say? And what are research funds also? Because I understood in part there's still lack of research, although one assembles everything, there is actually a lot, but there's not much consolidation maybe wanted also in part. So how do you see that as a research topic? How is it promoted? How open is research there in your respective countries? And how is the sensitivity to be dealt with? So these are two issues that I would be interested in.
Well, the first question is about how is the topic being dealt with in Germany? Basically, like very often is the case when there's discussion about a substance that should be banned. There's a huge fight by industry and by users who do not accept that this substance will be banned. And they say, but it has been shown to be safe before, so why should it change now? And what is very interesting, although everybody knew that the ban will be coming, everybody behaved as if there were no ban coming. And by this, they try to postpone the ban because they say, look, we are not prepared to stop using it. It's the same when there was the issue about high density chicken. Yeah, nobody prepared to put the chicken in a more decent environment. And so when the law came, they said, but we are not prepared. Now we cannot do it. So this is a normal tactic that is being used again and again. Do not prepare for the phase out of a product, then you will delay the phase out of the product. And that is very clear. At the same time, we had our first big publication on glyphosate in 2017 when it came onto the decision with the EU, because there was it had to be prolonged, and I pleaded, a lot of people said it should be banned immediately. I pleaded, give it a 3-year phase out. Very clearly say in 3 years it's gone, so there is time to prepare. They gave it a 5 years because the German government, the German Minister of Agriculture, actually cast a vote against the German rule. The Germans should have abstained because they could not find a common ground. And the German Minister of Agriculture in the vote in the EU actually voted for the prolongation of glyphosate against German rule, which of course was with the sanctioning of the German Prime Minister, Angela Merkel, because the only thing she said afterwards, oh, that was not nice. And nothing happened. And he was just disposed of after the elections then. But that was clear that he would be disposed of anyways. He was it was just a game. The farmers, many farmers have started not using glyphosate and reduced the use, but many farmers also say, as long as there is no clear official voice saying this stuff is problematic, we believe that it is not problematic. This is just like smoking. Yeah. You can keep smoking because although there are many studies saying it's a problem, there's no official thing saying so. And just like the cigarette industry has been found out to lie at people on purpose, Monsanto has been found out to lie on purpose. The Monsanto files speak clear language. And the German Office of Risk Assessment that was responsible for putting together the file on glyphosate for the renewal in 2016 that came up onto the desk in the EU. It was responsible for the European process. It was shown that they copy-pasted 73% or something like that from the Monsanto documents directly into their report. They did not do any own research. So it is very clear, the very typical discourse, as long as you can do not adapt, so you can postpone the ban. Now we have the, in the coalition papers, it is very clearly spelled out by the end of 23, no more glyphosate in Germany. The French are very clear, also because Gilles-Éric Zeralini, who was the first one who really pointed to the real problems with glyphosate and was then, he was kicked out of his job. He was reinstalled in his job as a whistleblower. And he's also very well connected to the French politics. And INRA in France has really changed the idea towards glyphosate years back because of this influence. Also, France and Italy have another, they have the hope that they have a new herbicide, pelargonic acid, that will replace glyphosate, but I have not heard much about it. So I do not know if it will run or not. So they have a vested interest of getting rid of glyphosate also. So there's a lot of interest going together. The second question about the scientific community and what does it do to us is very simple. When we started talking about glyphosate being an antibiotic in 2017, there was what we call a noisy silence. Nobody reacted. Because in the moment they start making dementi, people become, okay, why are they saying it's not that way? The best and most effective way of keeping something out of the public view is to ignore it. And I'm a very small voice. And so I have not been very important. Nobody has attacked me. I had one of my people, former PhD students, when he applied for a job in the German Julius Kühn Institute, he was told, well, we know what your boss thinks. And he didn't get the job. He got another job later. And so I tell my people, I'm sorry, but you have to put up with that or go somewhere else. I have had colleagues that publicly say no word, tell me privately, this is good what you're doing. So there's a lot of cowardice. But in the scientific community, there is no problem whatsoever because there is so many publications by now that show we have a problem. And people are so angry that their work is being taken apart by the European Science, EFSA, European Science and Food Authority, something like that. They basically disqualify almost every single paper and say, this was not a good study. So they say blatantly and outright, all the public research that is being done is no good. All the public money that is spent is wasted because all the results they make, we do not believe. And the public hand is accepting that. And this is the weird thing. But personally, I have no problems whatsoever. That has not affected me.
I would like to add a few words about, in addition to what Dr. Maria Finckh said, with regards to the research or researchers' role in making the case for the negative impact of this herbicide. First of all, Monsanto is a strong company. It influences decision makers everywhere, not only in Morocco, not only in Germany, not only in France, everywhere. Nobody would give funds to people who would like to work on these issues related to health problems. I remember I spent 6 months in North Dakota State University. I was still working on herbicide back in 94, 95. I did 17 experiments in the greenhouse using even radioactive elements to show how we can reduce the doses of given herbicides using natural adjuvants like olive oil, even petroleum, etc., ammonium nitrate. And when I presented a part of that work back in Morocco, all companies that are in the business of herbicides, fungicide, and insecticide, they turned their backs to what I showed as a result. One of them even said to me, we are looking for ways to increase our sales, and you are showing us how we can reduce 50% of the dose, because I showed that we can reduce the amount of herbicide to kill like oats, wild oats, by 50% to 75%. That said, I reviewed many papers on glyphosate impact on health, and I was amazed to see how dramatic the health impact of the use of that chemical on people's health, especially in countries who allows the use of GMOs. Because when you allow GMOs use, that means you can use as much glyphosate as you like, because the crop or the variety that is very resistant to glyphosate, you can use any glyphosate, any amount you'd like. I was amazed to see that glyphosate has a negative impact on dopamine. It gives dopamine deficiency by having an impact on tryptophan, which is the precursor of serotonin also. It has a negative impact on tyrosine. It can have a big impact on breast cancer for women. It can give birth defects. It can give some reproductive disorders. It can have an impact it can cause multiple sclerosis, leaky gut, and you name it. It's amazing how many research is there showing that this herbicide is killing people, making sick millions, if not more than that, and nothing is done, is because of that company that has the exclusivity of that herbicide is very strong everywhere, and it dictates its word to everybody. We hope that NGOs can move to correct this, and I see it not only the agronomists who can work on this, but also people in medicine, doctors, professors, independent professors should lead the work to show people that this herbicide and others should be eliminated from the market. And we should also work on alternatives, as Dr. Maria said. We don't have to eliminate glyphosate and replacing it by another chemical, but to lead the way to look for alternatives to chemicals.
I think we have a last question. We're about to run out of time. So Annemarie Wald, please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. My question is about the doctors you just mentioned. Is there an did you ever held a presentation in front of doctors associations, or for example family doctors and so on, because especially family doctors have the direct contact to patients and so on? Is there some awareness in the health system, in the doctor system?
I have gotten, because I have my presentations in German on the internet already, one from 2018 and now the new one. One is on the health effects of glyphosate, and this one here now is on the indirect health effects via the microbiome. So this is like an evolution. I've been contacted by doctors, also by chief medical doctors of certain clinics that thanked me very much for this. And some of them have been using this and discussing this with people. But if anybody asked me, I would give the presentation, no problem. I have given it in front of Nature Protection and others. But I'm not running around doing this because it's not my main job. But of course, if asked, I will do my duty. But my job is agroecological plant protection. And glyphosate is on the side because I have been traveling a lot in Brazil and working a lot with Brazilians and others, and also with, and then I have been discussing things with a veterinarian in Germany who basically started the big discussions in the 2012-13 time, Monika Krüger from Leipzig. And so I took over a bit, and then with Arina van Bruggen, we really worked on this very hard in terms of looking at literature. But I'm not doing research in terms of experiments. I do research in terms of reading. But I want to point out one last thing, and that's very important to keep in mind. Vanessa was talking about the power of Monsanto. But just in case you ever wonder, why did Bayer Crop Science buy Monsanto? And they bought Monsanto 2 weeks after the Monsanto files became public. So they could have stepped down from buying Monsanto, even at that moment, because of the lying of Monsanto became public. They did not step down. They said they had a plan B. The CEO of Bayer is still a CEO, although Bayer is worth less now than it was before they bought Monsanto. No CEO normally survives that. And it took me years to understand, and some people who told me, and then you can also research that in the internet, what is the reason that Bayer bought Monsanto and that the CEO of Bayer still is the CEO. The reason is that the main investor behind Monsanto is BlackRock. And the main investor behind Bayer Crop Science is also BlackRock. And if a large company goes bankrupt in the United States due to these scandals, it just goes bankrupt. But if a large company like Bayer Crop Science in Germany is in danger of going bankrupt, the German government will do a lot more than the American government to keep them going. And so basically the Germans are paying for the damage that Monsanto did via the German taxpayer for whatever reason. And this is covered up. And we have now the boss of our German Conservative Party is a major player with BlackRock. It's also on the payroll of BlackRock. And one could wonder if this is also one way of paying reparations for the Second World War to the United States. But definitely there are some stuff going on in the background that we all do not understand.
Thank you very much. Andreas, is there something you want to add? Your hand is still up.
No, just thanks a lot. This was not on purpose, but this is where the political science and the critical studies should come in.
Yep.
Yes.
Please do so.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Benasser.
Thank you all very much. Yes.
Yeah.
This is the last Aurora webinar for now. We don't have anything scheduled, but since this webinar series has been a success, we planned for 5 sessions. Now we have conducted 7 sessions. So we think we might continue maybe in a less frequent manner, but maybe every other month. We will make plans about that, and then you will find announcement via email, most likely. So thank you all for your participation in the webinar. Thank you to the speakers, and I wish you all a great evening and relaxing rest of the week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.